just like lumps of lead in the quartermaster's store. My eyes are dim, I cannot see, I have not
more food than she knew. With many miserable miles behind her and no money in her pocket, she did not like this feeling of being poor. With her family, she had travelled to the side of this clear, calm French lake in the mountains. She had a hope locked inside of her heart that they would all be safe and as far from the war as they could be. The summer's afternoon sun was rising in the sky, 2 years after the war had begun. Perhaps, she thought, the sun couldn't see this war below it, or it would have hidden its face behind the clouds until this madness has ended. Each weary footstep of the journey here had caked more mud upon her skin, and the sight of this water in front of her made her forget that she was a refugee from the city and the sound of guns and bombs. She was woken from her dismal thoughts by the sound of the rain falling on the lake. Perhaps the sun had heard her thoughts, and was hiding its shameful face behind the small summer clouds above. The rain was splashing on the surface of the lake, and it seemed to be boiling and bubbling, calling to her. She could feel this calming rain soaking into what was left of her ragged, best dress. Her mother and father had given her strict instructions as to where she could.
I make mistakes in spelling, Molly dear, said he.
A moving image.
Remember, it's the pen.
On a cold winter's morning, this young woman was sitting by the side of her mother's blazing coal fire. She was thinking about her sweetheart and how they had been to the cinema just last night, and how they had both laughed at the antics of Charlie Chaplin. She grinned to herself as she remembered how he had waddled, danced, and spun with an imaginary cane in his strong hands to keep her from thinking about him going away to war. Even now, as dawn was a memory, she knew that he would be far away from her and on his way to Flanders. In the heart of the Irish countryside, she knew that life would have to go on, and she would only try to think the best for herself and her soldier boy. One last time she conjured up the way that they had huddled together under an old woolen blanket on the hard, cold wooden benches to keep themselves warm. With Charlie Chaplin dancing on the flickering screen, he had promised that he would see her again, and they would be together in the cinema once more. The seasons moved on, and she could not believe her luck. A boy's face on a hero's chest. His father's gun had always felt good in his hands, even though he was a small boy. He knew the feel of the wooden stock at his shoulder and the familiar, well-oiled smell of this gun until he began to think of it as his own. It was his greatest friend, and he had practised every day to improve his aim and accuracy. Ever since he had been 8 years old, it had been his job to shoot and scare off the crows from his father's farm. At first, it had been the noise that the rifle made that had scared them away, but now he could line up their greedy black carcasses on the fence to warn away any other birds who wanted to steal food and seed from the land. With every waking moment, he wanted to be older and do his bit for king and country. It was all that the other farm boys talked about, joining up and showing the Boche a thing or two. At night, when he sat sighing into the reflection of the fire in the grate, his grandmother had told him that he would be glad of looking younger than he was, and to enjoy good looks while you've got them. He had been to the recruiting office twice now, and each time they had told him to come back when he had some whiskers on his chin and looked like a man. It wasn't fair, he muttered under his breath as he watched him. A piece of old Russia close to his heart. She had a great secret that she had locked inside of her heart. Not even her husband knew. No one knew. No one suspected that she was Russian. As a girl, some 10 years before, she had fled the oppression of the Tsars, with only a few small belongings to her name. Every night before she had left, she would listen to black shellac language records, and had practised speaking English like a true-born American, so that no one would know her true origins. That was all before war had been declared, before the Eastern Front on the borders of Russia had been turned into blood-soaked bitter battlefields. Her first language was Russian, and was only in her dreams that she would think and speak in her mother tongue, and she took the name of Natalie. Her looks were striking, small-framed with the sadness inside of her heart and eyes. It was this that had attracted the rich college graduate who was to be her husband. With her mixture of Russian vowels and parrot-fashioned learned attempts at English, she had developed a strong Bostonian accent. Many would not place exactly where she was from, and rather than slip from her disguise, she would ask them to guess where I am from in our great US of A. To keep from being discovered, she would always acquiesce to wherever they said. "I knew it! I knew it!" they would exclaim. "I knew you were from Wisconsin, Iowa, Kentucky." And they would
Fritzy boy, keep your head down, Fritzy boy. Last night in the pale moonlight we saw ya.
A head filled with hate.
You were mending your
Preparing for this new battle, he could not believe his luck. He had been given good food from a high-class restaurant here on the borders of Germany. He knew that this was a place that would never have let him in through the front door if he had not been a soldier. It had been a long, bitter battle, fighting against those people that he hated so much. Many of his comrades saw their service in the army as a job. It was something that they had to do, but he was filled with hate for all of the English. 2 years ago, when he was a boy soldier, he thought that the English would play fair and fight. It was the decent thing to do, to abide by rules of war and fight hard and with dignity. On that bleak, dark night, he'd been made to stand out of the deep trenches to make room for the stretcher-bearers to carry a wounded comrade. It was at that moment that the British launched their flare Vari-lights. They made it as bright as day and made him lose all sense of direction. He could not remain on the lip of the trench in the glare they gave to the night, and he could not return to the safety of the trenches. So he flung himself down into the dazzlingly lit desolation of no man's land and straight into the arms of an English patrol. When they had caught him, frightened and glare-blinded, they sneered at him. "You should have kept your head down. You're too small to waste a bullet on." These were the first words he had ever heard in English, and they were burned into his throat. Instead of killing him, they thought it would be,
"Smile, boys, that's the style. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile." So
unpacking all of his troubles. On a winter's afternoon that was so windy, she had watched her father going away from the edge of the city. He looked so proud as he kept time with all of the other men as they marched, laughed and sang their way out of all of the long rows of houses. With her mother beside her, they only returned to their own small house when they couldn't hear the men's voices. She was a little girl with a big smile, and before he had gone, she made sure that she had put the precious, the only family photograph of them all inside of his pack. This portrait of them had always held pride of place above the range in the front room. They had put their finest Sunday clothes on, and had posed in the photographer's studio, in front of his lavish furniture and a fine grandmother clock. Their house would never be as clean and full of beautiful things as that. Her smile grew wider as she thought of him finding it hidden in amongst his belongings. She didn't know when the war was going to end. Nobody did. But she wanted him to have a reminder of home, even if it was a pretend photographer's parlour. She knew, she hoped, that she would see him some day. She was sure of that, and she wanted him to be safe as he fought so bravely.
Pray to toil in USA when American girls gathered round and sought his company.
Everyone wanted to be his friend, not because he was kind and gentle, but because he was filled with a brutish energy that made you frightened to be his enemy. He was a fighter, a scrapper for whatever it was that he wanted. He had to fight for everything ever since being a child. In the Lancashire Mail, he was faster and better than anyone at cutting the threads, re-knotting them, and keeping the line of fabric moving. He would smile as he replaced the engraved knife back into his pocket with a satisfying click. The foreman, without his usual arguing, let him work on the machine that he wanted to work at. To be honest, it was easier than trying to confront him. He had even fought for the girl that he wanted to walk out with, even though she was filled with ideas about suffrage, about women having equal pay for equal jobs, even about women having the vote. He would never fight with a woman, and after that first stroll by the side of the murky canal, without saying a word, he had let her take his favourite machine. He might have been a brawler and would fight a man for the dispute of a sixpence.
Seen him, I've seen him, boozing up the private room. I've seen him, boozing up the
taste of
private
rum.
room.
He'd been a farm boy all of his life, small, confident, and envious of the regimented lines of German soldiers he had seen marching past the end of the far field at the end of the farm. He felt as if he was doing his bit to protect his country from the invading English. Farm work had kept him strong and thin, but there was a yearning inside of his heart that made him want to see more of the world than these fields and barns. It was not just working for his father that kept him wiry. The food they grew, the animals that they took to slaughter, were all needed by the Kaiser's army, and they, even though they were surrounded by food, had very little to eat. His mother would tell him to have an egg. There are always eggs on a farm. Even in wartime there is never a shortage. There are always eggs. But he didn't want yet another. He wanted chicken, and to see the world like these soldiers. He was not the tallest boy in the world, but when he woke up in this hospital bed, he had to think, to try and remember how he had got here. One damp and drizzly evening after his work, he had seen the soldiers fighting by the brook that was a border to his farm. So many changes to forget. Everyone knew Constance as a pretty woman. She was a rich woman who had inherited her grandmother's impressive house in the heart of the village. To be honest, the whole of the village had expected her to marry him that warm autumn of 1914. Thomas Meeks was a good man, quiet, strong, thoughtful, and never wanted to do things on an impulse. When she found out that he was not intending to join the army, their marriage had been cancelled without a thought. She would not accept that he did not feel good enough or strong enough to be a fighting man, to be a soldier. He had wanted to know what was happening in Europe, why an archduke had been killed in the Balkans, and why the tinderbox had been lit across the world. Everyone else had war fever. He wanted to know what he would be letting himself in for before he joined up. He wanted to know the facts. Constance would not, could not accept this, and saw it as a sign of cowardice that was reflected by the mood of the whole village. The whole nation had risen to the challenge, and the walls of the barns, shops, and houses were covered with posters beckoning men to join Kitchener's army, shaming them into joining because they would not be able to tell their children and grandchildren that they did not fight. She had been one of them that had labelled him a coward. Then, one day, he was gone. Like all of the other men, he was gone from out of the fields and factories. Now she felt guilty that she had forced him to go, the man that she had loved with every breath in her body. That was so many years ago, and everyone had heard the horrific stories of the trenches, and all he had asked for was the time to think about what he was letting himself in for. The war had spread from Europe to the English countryside, and when she heard that there was a shortage of food for the troops, she did not hesitate for a single heartbeat. She had her lands and lawns ploughed up, and worked like a farm to produce food for the soldiers. Her hands had become dirty, stained and ingrained with mud, and so strong, and she wondered if some of the food that she would produce...
When this bloody war is over, no more soldiering for me. Oh, when I get me city clothes on, oh, how happy I shall be. No more church parades on Sunday, no more putting in for leave. I shall kiss the sergeant major. Oh, I'll miss him, I will grieve.